Hi everybody, welcome back. We are still talking about the Civil Rights Movement. Today we're going to talk about the passage of the Civil Rights Act, and then ultimately we're going to begin our discussion of the Great Society, which we will continue, and then the election of 1964. So yesterday you guys took a look at the Kennedy assassination, okay? The really big thing that you have to know about the Kennedy assassination is it's one of the big things that's ultimately going to push the Civil Rights Act to passage. So when Johnson takes over for Kennedy and really begins to speak to the country, he's trying to figure out what to say. Like, what do you say to people who are so shocked by the death of their president? One of the things that he decided to do was talk about how he was going to honor President Kennedy's memory in trying to continue with what he had started. And one of those big things is the Civil Rights Bill, which had stalled in Congress by fall of 1963. By the next summer, the Civil Rights Act will be passed by both houses of Congress. And you see in this photograph here, President Johnson signing the Civil Rights Act. I believe this was July 2nd, 1964. You see Martin Luther King over Johnson's shoulder while the bill is being signed. Here's what the Civil Rights Act does, and this is what you have to know. It bans racial discrimination in most private facilities that are open to the public. So if I own a restaurant, but anybody can come into my restaurant and eat, I have to desegregate. So we're talking about movie theaters, we're talking about hospitals, we're talking about restaurants, we're talking about public parks, we're talking about schools, any private facility that is open to the public, as well as all public facilities, have to desegregate. It gives the government the ability to end segregation. It's really strengthened ability to end segregation in schools and in other public places. We already know that in looking at the school issue, a lot of states are dragging their feet. And let me tell you what happens in a lot of places in the South. To get around the integration of public schools, you begin to see a lot of private schools crop up. And that's a way that people can get around this integration. They can just send their kids off to this all-white private school. Another thing that the Civil Rights Act is going to do is create the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. This was supposed to eliminate racial discrimination in hiring, not just racial discrimination, gender discrimination as an example as well. So if you felt that you applied for a job and you did not receive that job because of your race or gender, you could report that to the EEOC and have them investigate to try to get you the job. This is really the beginning of what is going to become known as the Great Society. This is one of the big things you have to know about the Johnson presidency. Johnson was interested in civil rights, but he was also interested in the large number of Americans who lived in poverty. That was 20% of all Americans lived in poverty and 40% of African Americans lived in poverty. Johnson was keenly aware of the poverty that many of these people suffered. And that is because he grew up in poverty himself. Johnson grew up in kind of middle of nowhere Texas. That's not hard. There's a lot of wide open spaces in Texas. But if you really contrast Kennedy and contrast Johnson, they were very different. We've talked about Kennedy growing up, wealthy family, going to fancy private schools, going to Harvard. Johnson attended a one-room schoolhouse, like legit one-room schoolhouse. I've been there and seen it. He had one of those houses with like an open hallway down the middle. I believe they had an outhouse out back. His family did not have the money to send him even to the University of Texas. He attended the Texas State Teachers College because that's all he could pay for. So Johnson had also been traveling around and going to places like many communities in the Appalachian Mountains where communities were living in some really serious, just abject poverty, and he was trying to figure out what he could do about this. The program becomes known as the Great Society. There are two purposes of the Great Society that you have to know. The purposes of the Great Society were to end poverty and end racial injustice in the United States. A lot more on this tomorrow. Remember, the purpose of President Kennedy's trip to Dallas in November of 1963 was to kick off his re-election campaign for the next year. So Johnson's going to serve out the final year of Kennedy's term in office. Then he's going to have to campaign for his own term in office in 1964. He is going to be chosen as the Democratic candidate for president. The Republicans, on the flip side, are going to pick Barry Goldwater. He was a senator from Arizona as their candidate. And Goldwater is really the beginning of the modern conservative movement. Usually what the state wants you to do is kind of connect the conservative movement. They want you to go from Goldwater to Richard Nixon to Ronald Reagan, okay? Goldwater's beliefs included things like he didn't believe in the federal income tax. He was not a fan of the Social Security system, the Tennessee Valley Authority, okay, a lot of these like New Deal programs. He was not a fan of the civil rights legislation that went through Congress. He was not a fan of the Great Society, but he really scares voters with his views on nuclear weapons. He was against a nuclear test ban treaty, and he scared the heck out of a lot of American voters by suggesting that he would use nuclear weapons to end what was happening in Vietnam, and that really terrifies a lot of people. So here are the election results from 1964. The colors are swapped. Johnson's red, Goldwater's blue, and you can see that Johnson wins in an absolute landslide. 90.5% of the electoral votes. He wins 61% of the popular vote, which is huge in electoral terms. Again, Goldwater scares Americans, talking about using weapons such as, atomic and hydrogen bombs in the war in Vietnam. And remember, this is 1964, okay? Johnson doesn't announce escalation until after he's elected, so that doesn't start till 1965. So the Vietnam War is still relatively small at this point in comparison to what it's going to become. If you will look at the states that Goldwater won, he wins his home state of Arizona. He also wins all of these southern states. Why? You guessed it, because he's against the Great Society and he's against the Civil Rights Act. You're going to see in the next election, we get candidates who are very pro-Southern that will carry some of these Southern states. Okay, that's it for today. I don't even have any video clips for you today. Go on, do your quiz on Canvas. You're going to get some questions from this PowerPoint. You're also going to get a few excerpts from the Civil Rights Act. Please let me know if you have any questions.